Climate Crisis panel. My name is May. I'll be moderating today. I just want to give a huge shout out to Rebecca Thrope, who is not here today, but organized this amazing event with her wonderful speakers and the questions I'm going to pose today. I'd also like to take the time to recognize the space that we're in. Harvard University lies on stolen land of the Wampanoag, the Mutnik, and the Massachusetts people. So just like other panels from this week, I'd like to have a moment of silence for the indigenous peoples whose land was stolen. Thank you. In addition, today is Denim Day, in which we wear denim for survivors of sexual assault. So we recognize that there is a link between gender-based sexual violence and environmental injustices. So we'd like to also take a moment of silence for those impacted by sexual assault. Thank you. So just to give a little overview about what today's event is going to look like, we're going to start out with a little description of what Divest Harvard is about, and then I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers, give them a chance to talk about why divestment matters to them, and then we're going to have a Q&A session for about 30 minutes, then allow the audience to ask any questions that they have. So Divest Harvard started in 2012 as a call for Harvard to divest its nearly $40 billion endowment from the fossil fuel industry. And this call is threefold. First of all, disclose all investments. Second of all, divest from a fossil fuel industry which perpetuates climate injustice. And third of all, and perhaps most importantly, reinvest in sustainable industries and in local communities. This is a chance for Harvard to actually financially invest in the principles that it espouses as its moral values. So we recognize that divestment isn't the end-all, be-all of climate justice, but we do think that it is a right step in the right direction for a more fair and just world. So this panel specifically is about climate change on the local scale. It asks that we remember we're part of a greater community, one that's bigger than just individuals and institutions. So I hope that as you listen to our amazing panelists, you'll reflect on your engagement with your community and the incredible people in it who are working to fight climate change right now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. On my left, right here, is Henrietta Davis, who is the former mayor of Cambridge and longtime city councilor. In January 2014, she retired from elected office after serving on the city council for 18 years, ending her service in the position of mayor. She is a member of the Cambridge Net Zero Task Force. In addition, she currently serves on the board of the Mass Climate Action Network, the board of the U.S. Green Building Council Massachusetts, and is a member of that organization's Net Zero Committee. She is also on the board of the Institute for Market Transformation, a national organization promoting energy efficiency in buildings. As mayor, she founded the Cambridge Compact for a Sustainable Future, a collaboration between MIT, Harvard, and many of the city's leading businesses in the knowledge-based economy. This group is committed to working together to address climate change, especially by addressing energy use in buildings. Henrietta attended the Paris Climate Talks and became more convinced than ever that it is up to cities and states to take action. Further, that they should begin with the built environment because 40% of carbon emissions in the U.S. come from buildings, and 82% of Cambridge carbon emissions come from buildings. Next, we have Kanan Thiruvangadam, who is the director of Eastie Farm, an urban farm in East Boston focused on community resiliency, and of the JP Green School, a sustainability education program at JP Greenhouse, which is a passive solar and energy-positive house in Jamaica Plain. He also hosts What's Up Eastie, a radio show about local issues in a larger context, at ZoomX, a youth organization in East Boston. Kanan is also a climate-ready Boston leader. He has a technology background, has studied climate science, permaculture, and community engagement, and is passionate about regenerative and sustainable practices in agriculture and urban design. Kanan lives with his partner Rudy in the historic Belmont Square in East Boston, overlooking the harbor and beautiful Boston skyline. Next we have Randy, who is the political, This is switched around. Next we have Christine Jelstrup, who has been a Cambridge resident for over 20 years and is a national healthcare practitioner with a practice in Central Square. She is the mother of two and became an active member of Mothers Out Front 5 years ago in order to fight for a livable climate for children and all children. And last but not least, we have Randy, who is the political director of Mass Divest, a statewide coalition working to divest pension funds in Massachusetts from fossil fuels. City and county pensions in Massachusetts have $85 billion in assets, and the state pension has another $70 billion. Since October 2018, she has actively led the coalition to advance their 2019 to 2020 legislative agenda through education, recruitment, and lobbying. As Director of Recycling for the City of Cambridge from 2002 to 2016, she established composting programs and reduced waste through reuse and recycling. In 2017 to 2018, as Director of Outreach for the Bob Massey for Governor campaign, she led efforts to secure Bob's place in the primary ballot. Colleagues know her as a force of nature, thought leader, and trusted resource, someone who is strategic and inspires people to think big and take action. So a round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you for being here today. So I'd like to give an opportunity for you all to introduce yourselves. What is your role in the communities you're a part of, and why does divestment matter to you in the context of those communities? Start with you.
Well, I'm a former elected official, as you heard in my introduction. When I retired from elective office 6 years ago, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to keep on working on the issues that I had been working on, a lot of environmental issues in the city. And I was quickly called back to work on the Net Zero Task Force, which is a task force that was formed as a result of public action in Cambridge, where folks said, if you build any more buildings here, we don't want any of them to have any impact on the carbon footprint of the city. And so the task force worked for a year, and I was a member, of which I was a member. We came up with a plan that we recommended to the City Council that over the course of 25 years, we get rid of all the carbon in the built environment. As you heard, 80% of all carbon emissions in Cambridge come from buildings. It's important to note that I think not enough people know this problem. Most people think it's transportation or it's recycling, but really it's the built environment in Cambridge. That's where our burden comes from. So I continue to work in that area through the Mass Climate Action Network, which supports communities all over the state to start working on their own sustainability and climate efforts. And I'm on the U.S. Green Building Council Massachusetts effort to look at how architects and others in the building industry can start to focus their efforts on decreasing the carbon impact of buildings. And I serve on this national nonprofit board called the Institute for Market Transformation. That organization firmly believes that there are market opportunities here in energy efficiency. And one of the great victories came this week when somebody else on our board was working with New York City, which has just decided that they're going to decrease all emissions from existing buildings, and they have a plan to do it. So I feel like we're on the road on buildings, and but we need your help because people don't seem to kind of totally know that that's where the emissions are. And I have to say that Harvard deserves a lot of credit because they know it about their buildings, and that's why you see all these renovations here and all the disruption out of the dorms as they renovate and make those dorms more energy efficient.
Thank you.
That's a hard act to follow.
Well, thank you.
So you're
no, but
going,
I'm sure you can do it.
I'll try. So you're going from this scale to a tiny, tiny scale. You mentioned 2012 is when Davis Harvard started. I'm a newbie to climate activism, and that I didn't know much about climate science or climate change before that year, I'll be honest. And I was happy, obviously, without knowing all this stuff. But somebody suggested that I attend a conference where that was Bob Massey, was that? conference. It was a new economy conference. And Bill McKibben was there. Unfortunately for me, I listened to him, and then I was like, this sounds freaky. So I decided that I would convince myself, and I studied computer science and I have a master's. I kind of know something about logic and the scientific approach to things. I'm like, well, I should just learn this science so that I can be sure about this. So I went and took some courses in climate science, and this professor in Chicago, he was so good the way he taught everything, and the way carbon dioxide traps heat. He would just hold his hands up like that and go like an Indian dance. The carbon molecule would move between the oxygen molecules like that. So that movement is what makes it possible for it to reflect infrared radiation back into the Earth. That was very interesting the way he described that, and also methane, because it's got four-headed. You can imagine if there's like a four-handed Indian goddess and how she could move her head between those hands. So that vibration is what makes it possible for it to reflect the infrared radiation back in. Anyway, I learned a lot of science there. I took it very seriously, did all the assignments, and after that, of course, I was freaked out. And so I said, okay, we got to do something about it. And I had an IT job until then, which was quite cushy. But I decided that I was going to leave the job and do what I can in terms of community and environmental work. And 2012 is when that happened. And since then, I've been sort of jobless, but happy. You mentioned several organizations. JP Greenhouse is one of those, and that's, anybody can come visit that house. It's a passive solar house that produces more energy than it consumes. So is it possible this day and age to create a house that produces more energy than it consumes? Of course it is. It's just that the developers don't do it. And you ask them to do something they haven't done, they're like, no, we just want to do what we already know how to do. Can we just do that, please? So that is where it's the inertia more than anything else. It's not the science, so we know that. So we push on that front in East Boston, which has been discovered, by the way. I live in East Boston, and people didn't know that neighborhood existed but until recently, and now that it's seen as a nice and convenient neighborhood. So now people are moving in, and there's a lot of development going on. It's also an opportunity for us to engage and remind developers that the city has a Carbon-Free Boston program and a Climate-Ready Boston program. It has a Zero Waste Boston program, and how is the status quo building going to help with any of that? In fact, it hurts all those programs. So we get engaged in that way. But my main project is really something very close to my heart, is a small urban farm that I help run. And that's where kids come, and we ask them, where do you think your food comes from? Where do you think your waste goes? And the answer is usually supermarket and the trash can, right? And then where does it get to the supermarket from? And that's when we start to expand the horizons. And because the farm is something that works at a community scale, it's green, it's colorful, it invites everybody, and we can work across the board with all kinds of people. A couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you guys know this organization called Daughters of the American Revolution. So people asking me, who are you going to have next? KKK? No. Well, maybe, I don't know. But whoever is attracted to being in a green space, work with the community and growing food and sharing that food with the community is welcome there. And because we connect with people on that level, we're able to reach across all kinds of boundaries. Kids, older folks, middle-aged folks, people who speak Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, English, everybody, and people of different political inclinations. The other reason community scale solutions work is because you're connecting with somebody as a human. You don't see them as you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're a liberal, you're a Trump supporter. No, it's not like that. You also know that this person likes reading, they like gardening, and they share all these things with you. So you connect with them as a human. So that really, really, really works in order to build community resiliency. Ultimately, it's both about community resiliency in order to build adaptation. We don't know exactly how climate change is going to unfold, but when it does, we want to be ready for that, which means people with different levels of abilities being able to support each other. So we're building this very resilient community there. In the meantime, through waste management, stormwater management, things like that, making points about resiliency. If there's too much rain, and if you convert that extreme flood into extreme food, then that's a good thing, right? So this is ways to think about how we can be resilient. So a multifaceted approach at a community scale to climate change. We don't particularly get into divestment, but we point out that if you're going to process your food waste locally, turn that into soil, grow food there, then you're not sending waste out. That is carbon cut. You're not sending it to an incinerator. That's cutting further carbon. So just getting to the root of the problem by doing small community scale things that are very easy for people to access. Thank you.
So I'm also a newbie, so to the climate movement really. So I'm going to refer to some notes here. Mothers Out Front is a social movement that raises up the voices of mothers and empowers us as we fight for a livable climate for all our children. We started here in Cambridge about 6 years ago and have grown to more than 18,000 members across the country, 9 states with more states gearing up to join us. I've been a member of Mothers Out Front community organizing team for 5 years. As a member, I have taken on various roles as a coordinator and active volunteer. For example, right now I'm helping to coordinate our efforts for our energy efficiency campaign, which includes canvassing, tabling, presentations to various organizations, newsletters, and social media. To encourage residents to opt up to 100% renewable energy, to sign up for an energy audit for their home or apartment, and to consider putting solar on their roof. They're your big solar proponent. Mothers Out Front has 18 teams in communities all over Massachusetts, and we work together to affect legislation and policies on the state level that will move us away from gas and towards renewable energy sources. Divestment is important to me and to Mothers Out Front because pulling funding from the fossil fuel industry will be a major factor in its collapse, much as boycotts and divestment were major factors in ending apartheid. Divestment has a material effect, but it also has a moral effect in drawing attention to the issue of climate change.
Thank you.
Well, good evening. I guess I want to share a little story of how I got here to start, just to personalize it a bit. But I grew up in Staten Island in New York, largest landfill on the planet for many years, and moved into college with an eye towards reducing waste. And so, for many, many years in Cambridge here, I was the recycling director and was really proud to have established the composting program in town. And got to the point after 14 years thinking I'd like to move on. What is next? What is the impact that I can have, specifically in the environmental field? And looked at a lot of different areas that people were working in, and started to think about the term follow the money, right? And so looking at the influence that the fossil fuel industry has on our politics and on our environmental performance, I really started to hone in on divestment a couple years ago. And so that led me to actually meeting Bob Massey, who was running for governor in Massachusetts. He lost the Democratic primary, but Bob really moved the conversation on energy, I think, during the campaign, and has an incredible background on divestment. And so after the campaign, I thought, even though we're not in the State House and the governor's office, we can still make this happen and move the needle forward. And I joined groups that have been working on this for years, actually, Mass Divest and Fossil Free Somerville. And since the fall, those two groups have come together, and we have a really exciting legislative agenda this year with 3 different bills, one of which I want to spend most of the time sharing with you, which is it's a local option bill that would allow city and county pensions to divest from fossil fuels if they choose. And as a former city employee who spent many years pouring money into the system, I have skin in the game there, and I think that it's important for us to bring our goals around climate into alignment with where our public funds are being spent. And in between things, this fall I was able to go to the UK to go to a Green Great Britain Week, and found myself in a room full of financiers from around the world, ministers from the parliament that were focusing on the conversation that the fossil fuel era is ending. If we are to meet the Paris goals, then 75% of the fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. And if that's the case, then the value of fossil fuel companies are inflated and they're not going to, you know, deliver returns, especially in a long-term scenario, which is what pension funds are, you know, expect to do for young people and for people that are getting their benefits now. And so what I had learned is that pensions are actually the largest category of institutional investment. You know, and it's impressive looking at Harvard's $40 billion endowment. In the state pension fund is $70 billion. And combined, the city and county systems are $85 billion, which you'd mentioned earlier. And so I think that we're in the top 20 largest pension funds in the country. And we have a huge opportunity to, like I said, bring our values and our investments into alignment. And what's really powerful about this moment is that you can certainly make an argument for divestment on moral grounds for the climate you know, agenda. But I have a new hat on now, and I'm learning about financing. And you can make a solid argument about divesting from fossil fuels just on the finances alone. And I think that that is a game changer. And that folks that are not aware of that are doing a disservice to their members within retirement systems, and it is really a get on board kind of moment to avoid significant losses for institutional investors. So I'm really honored to be part of the conversation today at Harvard, and a couple weeks ago I was at another panel that you guys hosted with President McCow. And so it is an important conversation, and obviously it takes years to change and reorient and learn from each other so we can make the right decisions.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for your wonderful responses. Just to get the conversation a bit back to the local climate crisis, I want to start out by asking, what changes have you seen in the local climate since coming to Boston?
Well, I've been in Boston for a very long time. In fact, I was born here in Brookline. But climate-wise, I think when I first got involved talking about climate issues in Cambridge, when we had made a climate action plan for the city in 2002, I think. The idea that we would have flowers blooming the second and third time in the season, or that things would be happening kind of all out of whack. It's just the simple matters like that. Well, why is the cherry tree blooming again? But things really are happening that are quite visible. You can just notice walking down the street in October that the wrong things are blooming. And that seems, from my understanding, that seems to have to do with overall warming, and that that's had an impact on how the plants are growing. So that I see that. And certainly the extreme weather events that we've been fortunate enough not to be inundated like New York was, but it seems very possible that the storm, Katrina was, no, that wasn't Katrina.
Sandy.
That was Sandy. Sandy could have come just a little further, and it could have been a lot worse for us. And so we never worried before about the subway being flooded. We worried about streets that didn't have proper stormwater separation and so on, but the idea that you would really have flooding in the streets, it seems very real now.
Thank you. And how about you, having a farm yourself?
Well, it was weird. The very first year of the farm, it was a drought, and we didn't even have water connection. That's kind of where we got creative and said, why don't we just tap into neighbors' roofs and get the water from there? And we tested the water. It was great. You know, rainwater doesn't even have chlorine in it, which is even better for microbes. So we got creative, but we were hit with a drought in that year, and now we have too much rain. So extreme weather has been a problem. East Boston is kind of south-facing. You wouldn't think that, but it's kind of south-facing. And so when a nor'easter comes, you're going to get the brunt of the nor'easter if you're facing north or east. If you're facing south, not so much. Even so, we got flooded. Last January, 2018 January, there was, on the 4th, there was that, you may remember, bombogenesis thing, where in addition to the storm surge, when you have this sudden drop of air pressure, it's like having a vacuum cleaner just suck up the water. So the storm surge is what wind is pushing the water up through. And then on top of that, this vacuum is pushing water even further up. So it really came into the streets. And there was somebody kayaking in the streets of East Boston, and that kind of went viral. And even if you go to CNN now, East Boston kayak, you'll see the picture of somebody kayaking in East Boston. And we have a marsh, a 300-acre marsh. Many people don't know about it. Boston has this one last salt marsh. Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, Belle Isle Marsh, yeah. And that has, the low marsh, the high marsh, the middle marsh, all the vegetation, all the living things that live there, and the migratory birds that come and go. All of that depends on the stability of the marsh. If the water starts coming beyond the level that the plants are used to, they can't handle it. And nor can nesting birds and wading birds. All of them are disturbed, not to mention many trees fell during the storm. So it's a very delicate system that's being challenged by climate on the one side, and it's now going to see a huge development on the other side. So the marsh will be squeezed between rising seas and rising buildings. So not sure where it's going to end up. If we didn't have the development, the marsh would probably migrate, but now we can't do that. I was at a neighborhood meeting, was talking about climate change, and they were like, well, do you work for some insurance company or something? Or what? Do you want us to buy more insurance? Is that why you're saying this stuff? You're saying the ocean that's out there is going to be here. It's just ridiculous. So that kind of response you do get. And the next month, the ocean didn't get there. This was a hill, but the rain fell and there was a mudslide. And so the president of the neighborhood association called me and said, is this what you were talking about? I don't know, specifically not this, but the fact that you're on a hill means that the water has to go down somewhere, and as we build more, we create less and less spaces for the water to run down on. It's now narrow, more water coming down, it comes down more forcefully, takes out the soil, and the foundation's now exposed. There's lots of examples, and people are slowly learning. It has become a thing now, people know about it. When they go to a discussion, there's always a climate angle to that as well. When development is the big ongoing thing in East Boston, so whenever you go to a developer, one of the questions that comes up is, how are you going to handle this? So we're seeing a lot of examples of what is happening and what could happen. And I can give you a few more, but maybe later.
Thank you.
So for me, on a personal level, as a mother, I have kids who want to go skiing over February break, and we've had a couple of Februarys where it's hot, and then April break comes around and it's really cold, and so that kind of stinks. So that's been huge. In the 20 years that I've lived here, I'm seeing winters shrink and shrink and shrink to, maybe we'll have a couple of weeks, and I love winter and sledding and skating, and skating, that's over. I mean, the big ponds, Spy Pond and some of the big ponds around here used to freeze. And now you have to go farther and farther north to I mean, it's just, so winter is short, and summer is too long. I mean, I live in New England because I like it a little cooler, and I'm not looking forward to, they're predicting 90 days over 90 South Carolina temperatures here. So that's what I've noticed on a personal level. And then flooding. I mean, we have a condo in central Cambridgeport, and it might be in real trouble. And that's a huge investment for our family and our kids. And I'm really worried about that.
Well, a lot of what I was going to say has been said. I certainly, as someone who likes to go outdoors and like noticing the changes in the winter conditions is definitely something that I've noticed. But one thing I would say as a former city employee, the way that planning and preparations have taken place have changed over time. I mean, in the beginning we were doing greenhouse gas inventory assessments and figuring out where our emissions were coming from, and now we're talking about adaptation and what are we going to do when the flood waters come?
Not
if, and so that is a real evolution of policy and orientation, and I think we're very lucky, I think, in that regard, because there are a lot of communities that are not even using these words, not even thinking this way of adaptation and resiliency, and really understanding what the threat of sea level rise will look like in their communities, and how infrastructure needs to be thought about differently. You know, I mean, years ago I was in Copenhagen and I saw a skateboard park, and someone said that skateboard park was actually, it doubles as a water storage area for overflow. So, you know, just being really creative about living in these types of spaces that we are, I think, is really important change in thinking about the future of what city life is going to really look like.
Thank you.
I want to add that the thing that really worries me, we know about flooding, we know about, talk about sea level rise, but I'm really concerned, and the city is too, about heat. Because heat is something that's deadly, really, for many people. And we're not really prepared to keep older people cool, to keep children cool in school. Not all the schools are air conditioned. So the kinds of just basic things that we take for granted, because we've lived in a climate where it cooled off at night and we could open the windows and be cool in the daytime, we can't even count on that now. And I think that we're looking at tripling of the number of over 90-degree days in Cambridge. And so lots of people have gone to Maine because it's cool in Maine. Not so cool in Maine. I have a house on Cape Cod. I didn't put air conditioning in. The house is 10 years old. It's about to be too hot, really. And that's a change that's happened in this very short period of time. But my concern really is about vulnerable populations who, and we saw it in that terrible heat wave in Chicago, and in Paris there was a terrible heat wave, and many people died from the heat, and there were no resources to keep them cool. You can't count on sending everybody to City Hall to be cool. I mean, I think that's what really concerns me, and that's a kind of a silent, slow change that you don't notice until you suddenly realize you can't stay cool, you can't be guaranteed that you can be cool, and you worry about your neighbors and how they're coping.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask, as college students, it's really easy to feel disconnected from the surrounding community, especially if you're not from the New England area. So how do you view the place of college students in the broader community and their role in combating climate change?
Maybe we should start at the other end.
Yeah, that's I was thinking that too.
Yeah.
Well, you know, recently I've been really getting involved with legislative advocacy, and so I think that, you know, engaging, just jumping right into what's happening locally in democracy is a great way for college students to plug in. So, you know, you have a new zip code. Who is your representative in the House, and who is your representative in the Senate? And I'm not talking about at the national level, I'm talking about at the state legislature, and meeting them and going. And I think through Sunrise there's been a lot of focus on, you know, understanding where the legislators that we have stand on climate and trying to move them even more aggressively towards solutions. And so, you know, if anyone wants to help on the divestment bill, you know, we're going to be doing calls to legislators throughout the coming months to put pressure and just to demonstrate that there is support for divestment and that there is interest to do this for cities and counties. But I do think that, you know, in this day and age, that is one of the best ways to get involved, is to understand who your representatives are and to really learn how to be active and civically engaged on the issues. And whether that is climate, whether that is another issue that you care about, you know, it's amazing. The bills that we had filed this session were 3 bills out of 8,000 bills that were introduced in the Massachusetts legislature. So there's a lot of interests, you know, in that world of legislation and understanding how things work and how things move through the process. And certainly whether you want to be an elected official someday yourself or you want to be an advocate, but thinking about that space of government and you know, what interests you about it and how you can advance, you know, your personal issues and professional goals.
Awesome, thank you.
I think that Greta Thunberg is showing students everywhere that wherever you live, you can get involved. And I think, I mean, I don't know, the way my kids are, and Greta and the Sunrise movement with like 15 and 16-year-olds getting involved, I feel like for a certain subset of kids, the days of just going to college and partying and really just being carefree might be coming to an end for some people. And I think when you get to college, you're learning how to be future leaders. And I think it's wonderful that there are groups like Sunrise and 350, and I can imagine that Harvard must have some climate groups, right? I mean, I
Harvard
think
undergrads for environmental justice.
yeah, exactly. I think what you said is really important, but and I would add that for me, it would have been hard for me to take that kind of step on my own. So it's really great to get involved in a group. Mothers Out Front actually has a lot of young women who, because we're not just moms, I mean, it's anybody who cares about kids anywhere, and I think most of us do. So yeah, I would encourage getting involved in a local group.
Amazing, thank you.
I think that is very important to get involved in the community. But I think about college, and it's not easy to do more than what your course load allows you to do. And there's a way things are designed and to keep you busy with your coursework. And so I feel like it should go beyond college students. It should go to faculty, it should go to administration, and they should realize the importance of getting students or letting students involve themselves in the community. But that's such a good way to learn about whatever you're going to face after you get out of college, to just get involved with the community. So if you can find that additional time, then I would say, first, vote. One of the reasons young people are disrespected by politicians is because they look at who votes and they say, well, you don't matter. You don't vote. Your group doesn't vote. So I don't need to worry about you. I care about how I get reelected, and I know who's going to vote for me. I just go back to them. I am to question that assumption that everybody is wrong about whatever the message they've been sending you about what future you're preparing for. It's a very different kind of future. That you need to face the reality of whatever that future is, but also to know that you can shape that future yourself, which is really then incumbent upon you to somehow get through that coursework and then get out and change the world.
Well, as someone who ran for office for 14 times, I can tell you that having student volunteers on my campaign made a lot of difference. It's a great way to learn about what's going on in your city. It just so happens that this is an election year for local elections in Cambridge, and I think elsewhere. I mostly know about Cambridge, but definitely there will be 10, 12, 14 people running for office who can use help. And I can tell you that I think it's one of the things I miss most about not running for office is the involvement with the young people that were on my campaign. It was really fun, and we did a lot of good things. I want to point out something that I think is really quite remarkable about social media. I knew nothing about Facebook or really any other social media, just say 10, 15 years ago, 10, 12 years ago. So somebody worked on my campaign who was a Cambridge Ridge and Latin senior, and she put all her friends in Facebook, and guess who are my friends now? All these kids that were in they were her friends, and now they're my Facebook friends, so I keep in touch with them through that. But it's something that you have things to offer candidates who are running for local office. You have your experience, you have your skills, and some people work as assistant campaign manager. You can't really work as a campaign manager because the election is in November. And the person who started on my campaign and then went to Safari in August, well, we won't talk about that, we're friends again, but that you really, but there are lots of other things that need doing. There's a huge amount of data entry. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to do that. You just have to be pounding away. And not that there aren't a lot of geniuses here, I should note. So But there are also other things, parties that happen, you need people who are greeting people. You just need a lot of people on the ground who are talking with folks, and of course, social media and setting up your social media presence, which not all the candidates, I'm sure, are really equipped or have the time to do that. So it's a great time. In fact, as I was sitting here, I realized a family member who said she wants to intern at the Museum of Fine Arts and asked for my help to do that. I'm going to write back to her and say, have you considered, maybe you should spend your time working on a campaign this summer. It's a lot of fun, right, Andy? Randy. I mean, it's fun.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't have thought it was fun, but it turns out that it is fun, actually. So that's certainly one really important way, and I want to stay focused on that, only because I think that's now, it's possible, it's important. And there are people who worked for me who ended up in the community development department, they were interns. I mean, this kind of getting into the cycle where you're working with people who are in office, whether it's at the state level or the local level, really gets you involved and gets you to be a part of things. And your ideas get forwarded as well.
Just to clarify, when I was talking about politicians who disrespect young people, I had a
I
very particular politician in mind.
I definitely ignored yours, and I know that happens too. And there are frustrations. I mean, you may come with one absolutely fabulous idea, and it may not be what your candidate is interested in. But this is a way to find out about it, and a way to find out about how the mind of people who are actually running for office and serving.
Awesome, thank you. We're going to open up to questions from the audience now. So you can address it to individual panelists or the entire group as a whole. If there are no questions, I have a lot more prepared.
Hey, maybe.
We
Just
maybe,
give
we maybe
people
have
a
some
couple of
answers
seconds.
too.
I
Here's
have a
someone
question.
asking.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I've seen a lot in thinking about environmental policy is that whenever whether it's pricing carbon or building something or building bioswales or whatever it is, there's a tension between going forward really fast on pushing clean energy or whatever it is and sustainability, and also economic justice, because people have the perception that these measures are going to cost a lot, and something like a fuel tax is going to hurt people, especially low income backgrounds. So how do you see that playing out locally in Massachusetts, this kind of tension between different ideals within the environmental movement, and what do you think is, I guess I'm just curious as to your general philosophy on economic justice as it relates to sustainability?
I can speak about buildings. One of the most important things about buildings is that if you make buildings more energy efficient, you are costing the tenants less money to keep warm and keep cool. And it's economic justice is really built into energy efficiency. Because the cost of implementing energy efficiency measures is low, and the return is very high. The return to the tenants or the low-income owners or any owners at all is all positive.
I would add to, in looking at the money that's invested in their pensions, it is an opportunity to unlock and shift the things that we're valuing and that we're supporting. And I know the city of Boston has been focusing a lot on defining divesting and investing and looking at ways to connect the funds that they will eventually be able to move to prioritize communities that have been underinvested in, to try to identify ways that, investments that are still going to provide the types of returns needed to be compatible with a pension, but that are long-term investments in the community that are going to have long dividends, social dividends and economic dividends as well. And so I think that that's the exciting part that actually has attracted me to divestment in particular, because it's divest, invest. It's not just divest, and I do that because I think of it as like taking an inhale and an exhale. Once we get commitments to divest, and that's a huge rewarding process to get to that point, then now what? Now that that commitment is there, it's not just, we'll take it out and I'm not interested in what you're investing in. No. We have absolute interest in what are you reinvesting those funds in? What choices do we make? During the campaign for the governor's race, we were talking with a lot of different folks who put this great idea in my mind that a budget is a moral document. And that when you choose what you're going to fund and who benefits from that funding, it is a demonstration of what your moral, it's a moral statement. And I do think that there's an opportunity in terms of economic justice and climate justice to reevaluate, who we're benefiting by what we're investing in, and to understand the most vulnerable. I mean, one of the things that is striking is that the developments that go on in very waterfront communities that are not prepared for the climate change impacts that we're seeing. Our lead representative on this bill, Dylan Fernandez, he's a millennial. He represents Falmouth and the Islands, which is a district in Massachusetts that has the most coastline of any area. And just thinking about, well, what does that look like for communities that are going to be impacted? And understanding too, what's interesting looking at a statewide campaign, what are the climate impacts for a Boston area with a lot of coastline? What are the impacts for Amherst, Northampton, Springfield, Chicopee? In different areas of the state, what does climate impact look like there? And understanding that. From a farming standpoint, that comes up a lot. And just making sure that our communities are resilient as things change and affect all of the sectors. Because that's another thing that we think about when you have the conversation about divestment and investment, where, and there's some that will say, instead of even using those terms, just use the idea of, well, how are you accounting for climate risk in your portfolio? What is your carbon exposure? Because it may not just be that to prepare for the future, we should be divesting from fossil fuel companies. We need to be looking at the impacts of climate and the impacts of carbon exposure on every single sector of the economy. Because it's not just one energy sector that's going to be impacted. It's going to impact health. It's going to impact food. It's going to impact real estate. It's every aspect of the economy will be touched. So I think that that's important to really widen our lens and understand that.
Thank you.
I did some work to prepare for this panel to see if I could figure out a subject that I don't know that much about, which is divestment. And I learned that there are also some internal things you can do in your portfolio. So even before you get to divestment, or perhaps instead, or whatever, you can look at how your portfolio is deployed. So I'm not sure how much Harvard invests in real estate, but many portfolios include something called real estate investment trusts.
Mhm.
And the real estate investment trusts can index the property that they're investing in to only, even to put the properties on notice that they will only stay invested in them if they achieve a certain level of energy efficiency in the buildings that they're invested in. So what I learned was, I'll tell you, you can ask the asset managers to Energy Star benchmark their whole portfolio. In other words, any building that's part of a portfolio in a real estate investment trust, those buildings would have to be Energy Star buildings and would have to achieve certain levels of energy efficiency. Another idea is that if you have a group of funds, equity funds that you're investing in, and don't ask me what an equity fund is exactly, you can say, you can index them and say, we'll take the best. We're going to only be investing in the ones that achieve the goals that we want. So I think that's probably an important idea, because divest is you may not be able to achieve divestment tomorrow at Harvard, for example, but the idea that you could say, well, what about that portfolio? How can you make that portfolio more representative of the values that Harvard has about climate? And why should the portfolio, the investment portfolio, be so terribly different from what we're doing right here on campus? I think I think that sounded like a really good idea to me to follow, and I'm sure there are more than just those two that I mentioned, but worth looking into.
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to say that social justice and resiliency are really important to mothers out front, and And I agree with you, well, we all, I mean, Mothers Up Front certainly agrees with you on the 80% greenhouse gas emissions coming from buildings, and so that's why our campaign right now is about energy efficiency and solar and opting up to 100% green renewable energy. But our next campaign that we're rolling into is about rooftop gardens, and we're wanting to, so about social justice and resiliency, if we could, I mean, I'd like to hear about your gardens. But we're wanting to not only, cool the roofs, but have food, right? And for especially low income, because some of the low income housing, I mean, we're just getting started on it, but we've got a lot of rooftops in Cambridge, and we want to solarize and put green on, because it's not just about stopping the gas, stopping the flow of gas, well, and the leaks, but I mean getting off of gas, but we need to start sucking down the carbon everywhere we can, more trees, but so rooftop gardening can do that and help, if we do it right, help feed some of the people who are most in need.
Can I take a quick minute to respond to that question? Do you know of any social justice organization that is opposed to good environmental work? There isn't any. This whole argument is put forward by people who, in order to divide us. That's why it's there. And if there are people, if we're concerned that somebody who doesn't make a lot of money is going to be affected by some environmental justice action, I'd like to know who that is, because anything that you can do that is good for the environment is actually going to benefit those people first, because as the environment starts to break down, those are the ones that will be affected first. So I wouldn't even believe when somebody says social justice and environmental justice are opposed to each other.
I think it's worth balancing that, though. I mean, it's worth, on these boards that I'm on, one of the things that's happened is that all the funders have said, where's the diversity on your board? Let's see it. And the truth is that all the boards were all white. And so that awakened us and the different groups that I've been working on to the fact that we really aren't reaching out broadly to the community, and how important it is to make that shift. But in addition, to ask the question, is this great idea that we have to, I don't know, build this or plant that, is it really something that, what are the unintended consequences? Does it really fall fairly? And you have to ask that question. And as much as I'd like to see the electricity be all green, I want to make sure that when that happens, that the impact is not falling unfairly on people of low income. I don't believe it will, but sometimes you have to do something in order to make sure that doesn't happen. So having that test, I don't object to having that test in the question of is this action really going to be fair in the long run?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Actually, a question coming off of that. There are already organizations here in Boston, I don't know if folks have heard of the Boston Youth Fund, that's doing a lot of work of reinvesting, very different kind of divest investment, but reinvesting into communities of color and making sure that people of color-owned businesses are actually getting funding within communities and not having to depend on people and institutions outside of their communities. And so I'm wondering, in what ways are we ensuring that there is an equity component in the investment that is coming back to these communities that are being impacted the most by environmental justice, in addition to various other forms of systemic oppression? How are we thinking about bringing money back into this? Actually, not just back into them, but actually bringing money to those communities, because in some cases they've actually just never had money in the first place.
I will land on energy efficiency again, which sounds so dumb, but really, if you don't have to spend money on heating your house, you have more money to spend on food and on everything else. But what we haven't touched on here, I think, is mass transit, and talk about transportation and making transportation equitably available, making transportation come to where it needs to go. I applaud the T for doing something called the Better Bus Better Bus Project, you heard about this? So they tested all the bus routes to find out how they could make them work better in a variety of ways. And I think that that's a step in the right direction. I'm not sure how much is, the bus route that we're on has been changed already to come down Pearl Street, to make it shorter, make it faster. We really have to look at transportation as well. And the transportation folks you hear a lot about from bike people around here especially. They're very well organized and they're getting a lot of good things done. We know a lot about making the city friendly for pedestrians. We have Walk Boston that works on that, is very avid. But in terms of public transportation, we need more people really saying this is a very important asset. It's both environmentally friendly, but it gets people around. And it gets people around in a way that they feel like they can get to their jobs. They can take their kids to school if that's what they need the bus to do. And spending more money to make sure that the rapid transit runs better. All those things are very important. And I would think that having students get involved in that would be a really good place to spend some of your valuable volunteer time.
Randy, would you maybe want to speak about the reinvestment of funds
Yeah.
and how those decided?
So I'm just learning about that piece now. I think, for our campaign, we're looking at 3 big milestones. Get the bill passed so that we have the authority to do this. Get the divestment commitments, which sometimes can take years. Somerville took 4 or 5 years to get to the point where they were understanding the case for divestment. And then third, reinvest and have the conversations around that. And so right now, I think that bringing more members of the community into the divestment campaign and conversation, the opportunity there is to invite people to imagine what these funds could be used for. But what's really important that I've quickly learned is that it's not pension funds and other funds that are managed by fiduciaries are really serious pots of money, and you need to be able to meet specific criteria in order to kind of meet the bar for is this a sound investment for what the goals are for those funds. And so I think that from like a Harvard Business School perspective and for other economic students to be thinking about how can we create financial vehicles that are comparable to the kinds of investment opportunities that we're moving away from. And in some ways, it's easy to compare to fossil fuel companies the more and more we look at it. I was talking with this guy who was the former comptroller for New York State and managed their $150 billion fund. And there's a lot of research out there and reporting that's showing that the energy sector is the bottom sector, like the worst performing sector in the S&P 500 now for the last few years. And so I was like, oh, well, then it's not that hard to beat that. If you're like the worst in the economy. And that hasn't always been the case. Fossil fuel companies have been considered blue chip stocks and, really important parts of portfolios, and could be in years past, 20-25% of a portfolio. Now what we're finding is it's 5 to 10%, but in Massachusetts, I haven't come across a fund that is more than 5% invested in fossil fuels. So, it's really understanding, well, how much are we talking about? What are we moving it out of? How is the performance of those? And what do we want to move it into? And does that exist? Is that the scale that we need it to exist at? And how can we build that scale in order to be ready for the reinvestment? Somerville had $9 million that they moved out into fossil-free funds. They got their hand slapped by the state commission to say, no, move it back, that you can't do that. But what is ready tomorrow for a $9 million fund, $9 million infusion? What's ready tomorrow for $4 billion infusion? And so a lot of the conversations there are, well, is the solar market able to take that kind of, quick infusion? And is it, like with wind, a lot of those investments can be cyclical throughout the year and not necessarily consistent. And so we need to make sure that the financial returns and the profile of what we're reinvesting in meets that, those requirements for the kinds of things that they're expecting out of, does that make sense? So I think that, personally, I'm really interested in looking at green bonds. I think that green bonds seem to be an avenue for looking at reinvesting government money into communities, into specific environmental-minded projects that would be, structured in a way that could meet both interests. Community reinvestment, but also financial returns for retirees, because that's the goal of the pension. Yeah.
Would you like to add something?
Well, I just of course Googled it to find out. And what I find is that yesterday there was a post in Bloomberg Business Week about bonds to save the planet. And I know that there are a lot of very bright people who are out there looking for just these sorts of investments that both for sustainability and return on investment. I think it's a fabulous field to go into if you're looking for a way to combine kind of business and quantitative acumen and saving the planet. Because if you can find out the way to both save the planet and return money to retirement funds, that'd be a great thing to do. And there is a lot of work going on about that.
Yeah, the one
It's just there's not enough, that there aren't enough of these funds yet that have been developed.
Right. I would just want to add one thing. I mean, when I was in London, they were talking about how we need $1 trillion a year throughout the globe in renewables and in climate solutions to really get a handle on the pace that we need for the 12 years. We need $1 trillion a year. And so, my mind was like, where do we get $1 trillion a year? Where is that going to come from? That's not going to be one silver bullet. That's going to come from many different areas. So that's one thing, is anyone who says, oh, well, that's not enough. Well, it's just like, well, everything has to be put on the table. And what I've seen, and I would say Mission 2020 is a really great resource on the web. Christina Figueres was leading the Paris climate talks. Organizing of that event, and they have been saying that I think 200 billion of that trillion is going to be from public monies, and 800 billion is going to be from private monies. And they're trying to track if it's on track, and we're not on track. We're not on track with how much money we need to apply to the solutions, and so that's a motivating force. Is everybody empty your pockets, and who's got big pockets, and where can we assemble that mobilization, and how can we do that effectively?
Can I just say one quick thing? Yes. My friend in Costa Rica, who was here studying last year at the Retirement Institute, he said we really need a lot of people to work on the hydrogen economy-based model, because hydrogen is the next fuel that needs investment, and it needs work. So if you hear about hydrogen, whether they're talking about hydrogen vehicles, which there aren't yet, there are electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles in California, but not yet in Massachusetts. So promoting a hydrogen models for transportation, and I don't know what else needs work. There's a lot of work to be done. I know that part of what these sessions are about for. When I go to sessions like and sit in the audience, I'm looking for what is it that I can do? What matches my skill set with what these people are saying? And how can I go home with something back in the day that I would take to the city council? But here, you're taking it back to your life. You're taking it back to Harvard. You're taking it back to this community to see, how can I get a handle on what I can do? And it sounds like you recently found your handle. And, I think that, I guess we'd all hope to inspire you to find something that, that matches me. That's something I could really do. And I could work with my friends. I could make a living out of this, or I could eke out a living, and I could do some good too.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes?
Hi. So one problem that I think student activists here and elsewhere face is being told by maybe the orthodoxy that their methods are not civil enough, and they're not using enough reason, and that they aren't, they're trying to use force rather than reason, and not being politically correct, and not engaging in like dialogue the way that the orthodoxy would require it to be made. I was wondering, have you encountered any of those sorts of problems with people, people who are basically changing the conversation from environmentalism to the way that we talk, and to what degree have you been able to have success on that front?
You're referring to the same politician.
I have to laugh because, sitting at the city council, and when people came in, I don't think we ever really said that. We said 3 minutes, that was the civility, no signs, but everybody can talk. I mean, I think there's room for all kinds of action, really, and, when I was coming over here, I was thinking, it wouldn't be that bad to go to City Hall and talk about divestment, and then also talk. There's the reasonable part. We'll sit down and talk with you about what we know about how it works. But there are the signs aren't wrong. There are places for doing that sort of thing, just to get people aware that's an issue that matters to people. Talk to somebody else besides the people who are asking you only to be civil. There's a time to be civil. There's a time to make your point.
I think things like Extinction Rebellion are important. I mean, you have to have, if we're all just playing nice and speaking nicely all the time, then we don't get anything done. I think it's important to have people in the outliers getting arrested and I mean, really trying to, make us stink over here. Agitate, exactly. I think that's, how do you get a movement to happen if you don't have the agitators? And then you've got the people down the middle trying to make policy. I think it's important.
You could say to somebody who says to you, be civil with me and reason with me. You're not listening to reason. The science is there, and science is all reason, right? Why would we be hurting ourselves by doing the wrong thing, which is what it is, to invest in more fossil fuel? And that's clear, but we're still doing that. So you're not listening to reason, and why are you asking me to be civil? And I think civil is kind of overrated anyway, because look at all the colonization that went on. So when the British went to India, they said, we want to make brown but civilized people. You may be brown, but we want you to be civilized. And that's why we're here, and we'll show you how to be civilized. Killed a lot of people, did a lot of damage, stole a lot of things. So we say that's civil. And according to them, that's civil. So I think it is overrated, and when reason does not work, you have to do what you have to do. And right now, the power is with the status quo, which wants to keep the way things are. And in order to shake it out, you have to do what you have to do.
I would also add, I think that if you have something that you want to affect change for, you've got different groups playing different roles. And so, the pressure from an emotionally charged campaign that's getting headlines, that's making people uncomfortable, that's forcing a topic higher on the priority list because of just the amount of attention, is providing so much power to the topic and to the campaign, right? But at the same time, that group should be partnering with a group that's working from the inside, writing the legislation, understanding the challenges for that, for the leads, the lead filers, and understanding how it's really going to move through the democratic process or be implemented within a department. The mechanics of actually day-to-day stuff. I think that those can be uncommon allies, but we need to be building partnerships with different types of groups that are working in different types of ways. I was with someone the other day who was saying, I wish that some of the legislators who, need help because there are special interests going into the State House, representing different utilities and putting pressure on to, protect their interests. Those legislators need an outlet, and a safe outlet, to say, I need help. I'm getting pressure from these folks. How can the outside constituency groups, bring that to light and to say, we are protecting our rep, they have the right stance, or we're going to primary you, and that the dynamics there. But I do think that there is a need to understand the nuances of how things work internally. I mean, I started as a college activist. You know, we were protesting pesticide use on campus, and you know, we were. I'm just thinking of a million different things, but we had like, you know, an online rally, an outside rally where we marched to the base of the president's building where he was out there. We had giant posters, you know, painted beautifully with dandelions. We were really concerned that the dandelions were being sprayed when our grandparents and our younger kids in our family were coming. The most vulnerable in our families were coming to graduation, and they were spraying the campus with poison. And in that moment of like screaming outside during this protest, and the president's office was 5 stories up and the blinds were drawn, I thought, I need to be in that office. You know, then there were, and we went in, we sent like 3 people in, but that was a moment where there's people on the outside, people on the inside, we know each other, and our strategies are informed by each other's actions, and that was really powerful. We eventually got, you know, a ban on pesticides in the university, and so I think that it's important to be able to be savvy to work from all angles.
I agree, we should be united.
So I'm wondering, just kind of like from a student organizer perspective, often it's really hard to get the inside side. So like, do you have any advice for how to shift this narrative that we're focusing on demands instead of reasons? When you aren't in power, how do you shift the narrative to your side? Do you have any advice? Yeah.
Well, are you talking about at Harvard specifically, or talking about legislatively? The way to go is the way Mothers Out Front has done it, which is that you make appointments with the legislators, you come in with 3 or 4 people, and you say, here's the thing that we're concerned about. And that's what lobbyists do. I just heard that at Congress, there are 2 pharmaceutical lobbyists dedicated to each person in the United States Congress. Oh my gosh. I mean, there's full-time people paid, you know, the billions of dollars. We don't have anything like that on the other side. All we have is all of us taking the time to get together with a few other people, make an appointment with a congressman or a state legislator, sit through the fact that they're going to cancel 3 or 4 times, by the way, I mean, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to make an appointment, and they're going to say, oh, sorry, I got to go this way, got to go that way. Right, Randy? Right?
Or you'll get what they call staffed out. But
Oh, yeah, staffed out.
I don't mind, because I love talking to staff. Staff are learning, they're young people, and if you talk to a staff person and they understand your issue and they care about it, and oftentimes they will agree, you now have somebody on the inside of that office. That's one way to go on the inside, is become friendly with the aides and to understand who they are and become friends with them. But it's powerful to be able to just know the impact of calling your legislator. I mean, I was told recently that if someone in the House gets at least 10 calls on an issue, they immediately go talk to the leadership about that issue.
Marjorie Decker told us that at a meeting, that if you just got 10 calls. But the point here, I think, is relationships. The more you, and we all have the right to try to make meetings with our elected officials. And the more you do that, the more you create relationships, the more change you can affect. And what's interesting with Mothers Out Front is we're starting to really get involved in legislation. And we're finding out that we can write bills. Right. Like, we were all like, who knew, right?
Yeah, they wrote the bill.
Yeah, exactly. So one of our moms was in the last session, she's like up until midnight helping to write the bill that they were going to present the next day. And so now we've got a really full force legislative part of everything else that we're doing. But it all comes down to having good relationships with people. And anybody can create a relationship with somebody.
But it does take time.
It takes time
consistency
and effort. Yeah.
And consistency, so that, I mean, that's why it's good to be part of a group, because you might not yourself be able to make it to every one of these meetings, but if there are a dozen of you that are dedicated to one thing and 3 of you can make it every time, each time there are 3 people that show up, you can really make a difference. I mean, what it sounds like, I think you need to say it took a long time for the relationship with Mothers Up Front to be,
That's true.
so it didn't happen overnight.
Concerted effort.
They were
over time.
relentless,
Yeah.
relentless for what, 4 years maybe? And you don't have that much time, but Harvard students or the Harvard student group has that much time. And, just being consistent and staying on message or aligning with other groups that are consistently there, you can really make something happen. Go ahead.
If you want somebody to do something for you, the best thing you can do is to make it easy for them to do it. So if you're asking somebody to write a support letter for something that you're doing, write that letter, just send it to them. That's the best thing, they just sign it. So it works very similarly with politicians. Don't tell them what your idea is, what your vision is, what your thinking is. Just write the bill. Write the bill, and they'll look at it, and maybe they'll modify it. That's where the staff come in, and we work with the staff. So I think that's part of making it easy. The Citizens Climate Lobby does a lot of that work, which works with both sides, as we say. There should be more than two sides, I think, but they do work with both sides. So you asked about narrative, and what's the narrative that we should be using? And I was thinking, well, this is Harvard. And what is Harvard teaching the best brains in the world? What is it teaching? It's teaching that it's okay to say one thing and do something else, right? It's teaching science. Is Harvard not teaching science? And it's not investing in what science is the best thing to invest in. And it's okay to rob a child. In general, it's okay to abuse people and other lives who can't fight back. Might is right. This is what Harvard is saying. And you need to be clear about that. You have to say to Harvard, this is what you're saying. This is the message we're receiving from you. Maybe you're not saying it in so many words, but this is the message we're receiving. And is this a stupid organization? Because it seems like it's myopic and greedy to destroy the very land that the institution is on. That is what climate change will lead to. This is right on Charles, on either side of the river. And if the river were to flood, it's going to affect Harvard in ways that can't recover for years. So the next question I wrote down for myself is, how smart is Harvard? If it's very smart, then here's an opportunity of a millennium to lead the world by doing something that's really hard, difficult, perhaps even sacrificial from Harvard's perspective in the short term, but ultimately good, wise, and very becoming of an institution that creates the future society by shaping young minds. So here's an opportunity to be very smart by seizing on this opportunity. That I think should be the narrative.
Thank you. So we're nearing the end now. If you all have any closing remarks you want to add, now would be the perfect chance.
I'm just thinking about the fact that the divestment movement has had successes in Massachusetts, in New England, and to maybe get everybody in a room, the decision makers, the people who at UMass decided to divest, and Salem State University, and Hampshire College, and Yale, to talk with the folks at Harvard, because they're in the same positions and they're considering the same things, and so it's not somebody who is not. They need to talk to their peers, and I think that those examples are really, really powerful. And to understand the global context of the movement, to continue to come back to the global context. I think that divestinvest.org is one of the best resources that I've found. I think they have a similar list to the gofossilfree.org, which is 350. But the running total is over 1,000 institutions globally that have divested in full or in part, totaling over $8 trillion in assets under management. I just read that the World Bank is no longer going to be funding fossil fuel projects. There's at least 14 insurance companies, mostly in Europe, that are no longer interested in providing the types of insurance that they used to. And there's massive players walking away. And the message in Europe seems to be, if you don't have a transition plan, then you need a wind it down plan. And so, that's really powerful. It's not like it's just us in Cambridge or in some local community that are looking at these questions. Because this is a global movement, there are examples and case studies and best practices, and to tap into the momentum and the language. That's one thing that I really appreciate in looking at what's being written in the UK around these issues, because it gives me new language with which to describe this stuff. Investing on ESG factors, environment, social, and governance, is no longer niche, it's really mainstream. And understanding the shift that's happening at a global level is what can empower us at the local level and give us even more credibility, I think.
I think it's super exciting that you guys are doing this, that there's been a 5-year interval, because I was here 5 years ago and went to the opening with Bill McKibben and this woman from the Polynesian Islands that are going to disappear, and it was very powerful. And then, so I brought my one son to that, and then my other son to the rally at the end of the week on Friday. And it was, it was hopeful, but it wasn't, it now feels like it's been 5 years, things are changing. If Harvard leads now, it's just so close. Why wouldn't they at this point? So I think it's wonderful what you kids have done, and that you've got full force trying to get Harvard to divest now. If not now, when, right?
So I think it helps to try to understand why people do what they do and why they don't do what they don't do. In this case, there's a fear of alienating the fossil fuel industry. And they're big and they're powerful, and they can do stuff to you. So the fear is understandable. At the same time, you have to know what your power is. Harvard's powerful too. If Harvard says, you know what, I don't care about those guys, I'm going to divest. That will change the world, and they won't be so powerful anymore because they won't have that money, right? Because everybody else will follow suit. Harvard divesting is bigger news than Massachusetts divesting, I think. So it will change the world. So you have that power.
Maybe not.
Not by amounts, but by the name.
It's not a competition.
Everybody. Well,
Yeah, it's Harvard. Think about who
there's
Harvard.
gravity in Harvard making that choice.
Also, Harvard's creating sort of the future world, and think about how many powerful people in the world are from here. So I would say, don't fight the power, be the power.
Well, I want to end, I don't want to be the last one to speak and only say what I was going to say, but, which is, I was very successful as a city council, right, Randy? I got a lot done. And one of the reasons I was successful is I could see where the openings were. And we got we went through a lot of openings and got Cambridge, a small city, to be one of the greenest cities really on the planet, but certainly in the US. And that's because we could figure out how to take the next step. Is the next step here, divest now, or is the next step here, and this sounds so lame, but I think it really, how could they say no to a study of what divestment would mean for Harvard? How could they say no to studying, this is a place where you study things? How could they say no to setting up a commission to figure out the future of Harvard investments? There's a way for students to get involved, I think, in saying what are the values, but also what works. What are some of the best practices now? And to start the ball rolling. Because the ball might not roll tomorrow to divestment, but the example is of the net zero action plan that we have as a city for all buildings in the city, including Harvard, including all the existing buildings, that they all have to be zero emissions by 2050. That started with an idea, but we spent 15 months studying it. And when the idea first came up, MIT in a meeting signaled to me, no way, this can't possibly happen. Well, guess what? In the end, at the end of 15 months, they said, oh, that sounds okay, we can do that. Because they had a chance to really see what it would mean for them. Harvard had a chance what it would mean for them. The city knew what it meant all. And we could take a bold step, because we really knew what it meant if we did that. And it's a bold step that the city took that's leading the way for cities all across Massachusetts to take also, to become net zero in their buildings. And so sometimes you need to be a little incremental. You need to like send it to a study, as long as the study is real, as long as it's from the president's office. I would design it this way. I would have the president of Harvard design some kind of task force to look into divestment or into responsible investing and find out what they came up with and put the best minds on it. You know, students, faculty, you know, their investment people, and I'd bring them all into a room and I'd say, you know, are these all the right people that need to look at this? Do we need anybody else? What's the process we need to follow? We really need to figure out how we can make this change, because there's so much, we can see that other universities can do it, we can do it too. We just need to know how to go about it. So that'd be my first step. My first step would be put together a commission or whatever they call them here at Harvard and start looking at the process and moving toward divestment of the portfolio. Responsible investing might be first. I don't know, but start someplace. Just start. That sounds better than incrementalism, right?
Not to continue, but like, it seems that one of the fears for the universities that you touched on a bit is research funding.
Ah, yes, MIT.
Well, both universities
Oh, yeah.
have real reservations, it appears to me, because of research funding. And in the last talk that I was at, the issue was raised around, well, if we did that, how would that impact academic freedom? And so there's a lot of interesting concepts that are not really related to divestment or investment or returns. It's about these relationships. And so if there is another few forums and opportunities to address that without, you know, in a easy platform, not just like an antagonistic way, I think that those questions really need to be brought up to the surface, and they need more oxygen. Because if there is a concern that the scholarship and the level of research and support that the university gets would go away, then that's a question that needs to be answered. Where should that funding come from? How much do we stand to lose? Because there's some other things that I don't think are really have been explored enough in order to have an informed conversation to combat those fears.
Okay, thank you so much. Could we have a final round of applause for Mary